They closed my bedroom door saying, "This is ours now." They didn't know the deed was still in my name. And it is astonishing how softly a door can close when it is closing on your life, how a latch can kiss the strike plate with a tiny domestic click that sounds to the person on the wrong side of it, like a verdict delivered without a judge. I stood in the hallway long enough to smell the citrus oil they had rubbed into the wood that morning, and the faint sweetness of the baby's shampoo drifting from down the hall, and I told myself to breathe through the heat blooming at my sternum because I am 78 years old, widowed for 11 of those years, the sort of woman who keeps her bills folded by due date and her spices, alphabetized, the sort of woman who believed in keeping peace even when peace kept erasing her. And I live, if living is the right word, in the downstairs room that used to be a sewing nook, a narrow space off the laundry where the machines thrum like a heavy heart at night, in a house that sits on a corner lot with hedges clipped to obedience and a porch light that burns all evening like a smile you hold for too long. I am the owner of this house in the way paper makes you the owner of anything, which is to say I paid for its bones and taxes and roof repairs and the gleaming stove that photographs well for holiday newsletters, while my son and his wife curate the surfaces and the story. And I suppose you should know my name before we go. Further, my name is Leonore, though most of the time in this house I am Mom, said in that careful, neutral tone that spares no feeling and offers no invitation. And I am telling you all of this now from the square oak table by the back door where the light is good and the linoleum gives under my heel like an old promise, because it matters to begin in the exact place where the hurt began. Not years ago when I sold my little condo and moved here for a season, not on the day I signed the check. That made the down payment possible because he couldn't swing it alone after the second baby. Not even on the afternoon I took my wedding ring to the jeweler to have it sized up, and then, in a sudden fit of truth, tucked it back into the velvet box and placed the box at the back of the flower bin with the birthday candles and the spare keys. But here, in this hallway with the new paint and the old family photographs boxed in the garage because they didn't match the palette, listening to my son say through the door, "We just need the space to function as a nursery, Mom. It's practical." And to my daughter-in-law add breezily, "You're so good at making do. You'll love the downstairs. It's cozier." The two of them unaware, or unwilling to be, aware that the law has fewer adjectives than they do, and that titles do not care for mood boards. I would like to tell you I shouted, that I put my palm on the door and shoved it open and said my name aloud like a bell. But the truth is that I stood there with my hand on the knob and felt the low rush of heat rise to my face and then drain away. And I let the silence do what silences always do in families like ours. It settled. It thickened. It became the weather we were meant to pretend was fine. And when I finally moved, it was not to make a scene, but to collect the small box of hairpins I kept in the top drawer of the dresser that had already been emptied of my sweaters and stacked in the hallway. A little tower of folded wool, standing, at attention, beside the laundry basket like good soldiers waiting to be told where to march. I tell you, I am 78, not to beg indulgence, but to mark the accrual of years during which I learned to be useful rather than central. Learned to enter rooms with casseroles and leave them without a fuss. Learned to call my caregiving help so no one would have to acknowledge that I was the infrastructure. And yet even now, in the echo of that gentle theft, I can see how I taught them to speak to me with the calm of people rearranging furniture, because hadn't I taught them for decades that I had no weight of my own, that I could be lifted and set down wherever the need was greatest? I carried habits into this house along with my boxes, the habit of apologizing for the space I take, the habit of smoothing a conversation with facts that make other people comfortable, the habit of calling my own wants silly, and perhaps the worst habit of all, the one the world praises you for, until it makes you disappear, the habit of being reasonable. But a deed is not reasonable. It is stubborn and rectangular and printed in a font that does not do small talk. And my name is on it in full. The name my mother said when she brushed my hair on the night before my wedding, the name on my nursing license, the name on the envelope with the mortgage coupons I mailed in for the first 6 months before he took it over. And if you are wondering whether I remembered that fact in the hallway with the citrus oil still fresh and the baby's mobile tinkling upstairs like fine rain, I did. Like a slow bloom behind the ribs, less threat than anchor. And I tell you this not to spoil the story, but to make the rest of it bearable. Because there is a particular humiliation in knowing that the people you love are sorting you into a smaller life while believing themselves kind. And it helps in the hour of such unbeautiful mercy to have one hard square of truth in your pocket. You might ask where I live now, and I will answer plainly. I live in my own house as a guest who was not given a return date. I live among labels, pantry, kids' snacks, misc linens, a seasonal, that never include my name. I live in a neighborhood where the women carry water bottles the size of small children and say community when they mean club. I live with a son who never raises his voice but edits my presence like a sentence he is tired of defending, and with a daughter-in-law whose competence is a kind of armor that makes even her compliments feel like invoices. And I live with a baby whose warm head fits under my chin and whose milky breath redeems hours that would otherwise be unlivable. If you came to the back door in the late afternoon, you would find me with a dish towel over my shoulder and the smell of garlic in my sweater, listening for the dryer's sigh and the soft grunt of a waking infant, measuring my usefulness in small units, burped ounces, folded T-shirts, the way a stain yields when you remember to soak it in cold water. And if you stayed until night, you would see me sit at this very table with a cup of what passes for chamomile, laying out the day like cards in a patient game, finding the places where I said, "Of course," when I meant no, where I smiled instead of saying, "That is not how you speak to the woman who kept your fevers and your secrets." And before I put the light out, I would open the top drawer of the little desk I bought at a church. Rummage sale when we still said such things without irony, and I would touch, almost without looking, the envelope with the county seal and the tidy tabs that hold our names to the land, the thin official comfort that has kept me from floating entirely off the map of myself. I don't tell this as a complaint, though you will hear the bruise in it because accuracy requires I acknowledge the other truths that braid through the insult, the knees that ache by evening and make stairs feel longer than they are, the radiators that knock like a visitor when the weather shifts, the way loneliness can creep into a house even when the house is noisy, and the way I colluded in my own miniaturizing out of a devotion that thought it was love, and a fear that pretended to be practicality. What will be easiest for them? What will make the least trouble? What will keep the peace at the table where the children eat? Perhaps it is also important to say that I did not always live like this, that once there were weekends I filled with my friends and a tablecloth blue as lake water and the sound of someone laughing in the kitchen while I sliced peaches, that once there was a man who slept heavily and read slowly and kissed my wrist as if it were a telegram arriving at last, and that his absence trained me to be both stronger and more grateful for small continuities, so that when my son asked for help, I heard my husband's voice say, "We can do that," and because there was money, there was no question. But money is a trickster. It makes you think it can carry all the meanings your mouth is tired of saying, and so the check became love, and the deed became trust, and the spare room became for now. And here we are in a corridor that smells of lemons and policy. I am not naive, not anymore, and I am not vengeful, not yet, and I am not finished, not by a stretch, because if you have ever stood on the other side of a door and listened to your own child assign you a smaller life, then you already know there is a clean flame that can rise without smoke, the kind that doesn't ask for witnesses or applause, only for a steady hand and the privacy of a mind that has stopped explaining itself. And perhaps the only miracle of age is that you start to recognize the moment the tide turns. The second, a sentence becomes a boundary and a sigh becomes a decision. So yes, they closed my door and called it practical. And I walked downstairs with my box of hairpins and my old blue cardigan and the little brass key to a room that was no longer mine. And I made us all a pot of soup because the baby would wake hungry. And it is not her fault that adults rehearse their harm in the language of efficiency. And later, when the house was quiet and the laundry room smelled a little like heat and a little like rain, I sat at this table and made myself as large as I could inside the body I have. And I said my name in a whisper, just to hear it travel through a space that belongs to me, even when the people in it forget. And I thought about ink and paper and locks and voices, and about the strange mercy that sometimes the thing you paid for with your silence keeps a record of your name even when you do not speak. And I decided, not loudly and not with a speech, just with the evenness of a nurse taking a pulse, that I would not be arranged anymore. The defining moment was not loud, not theatrical, not even cruel in its performance, but cruel in its silence, in its careful ordinariness. And it began when I stood in the corridor outside what used to be my bedroom and heard the quiet snap of the lock sliding into place, my son's voice muffled through the door saying, "This is ours now, Mom. You'll be more comfortable downstairs," spoken with the casual finality of a hotel clerk assigning rooms, not a child speaking to the woman who carried him through fevers and late-night terrors. I lingered long enough to hear my daughter-in-law's softer echo. "She's adaptable. She always manages." A sentence intended as praise but landing as erasure, because adaptability in their mouths was nothing more than a polite term for disposability, and in that instant something split inside me, not broken exactly, but revealed, like plaster cracking just enough to show the old brick underneath, solid, stubborn, unyielding. I had thought the humiliation would come in public, at a dinner table, at a holiday gathering, some moment when they would dress their impatience in laughter. But no, the truest humiliations happen in hallways, with slippers on your feet and the smell of supper still in the air, when no one thinks to notice how your chest caves in. I went to the little room by the laundry, the one they had prepared for me with new curtains that smelled of plastic and a narrow bed that sagged in the middle like a weary hammock. And I sat there with my purse on my lap like a woman waiting for a train that never arrives. On the surface, nothing had changed. The house still hummed with the dishwasher and the buzz of the refrigerator. The baby still cried upstairs. The dog barked once at the mail carrier. But inside, I knew a line had been crossed that would never uncross itself. Later that evening, when they were out on the patio with their wine and their low, murmuring voices, I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope I had carried quietly for months, the deed folded with military precision, the paper thick and official, stamped with the county seal, my name written in full in the heavy ink of permanence, the kind of writing that doesn't yield to interpretation or preference, and I stared at it with a mixture of nausea and relief. It was not that I wanted to wield it like a weapon, not yet, but that I needed to remind myself I had not vanished entirely into their narrative, that somewhere on this land, under this roof, my existence was carved in letters the law still recognized. The betrayal was not only that they closed a door on me, it was that they closed it while believing I would never think to open it again. I remembered the phone call from 2 years earlier, my son's voice quick, urgent. "Mom, we found a house, but the bank is difficult. They need more equity just until I can refinance, just until we're settled. It'll still be your home, too." And how easily I said yes, selling what remained of my savings, signing where he asked me to sign, the pen trembling not from doubt, but from arthritis, believing, as mothers of sons so often believe, that generosity would weave me into the fabric of his life forever. That was the real cruelty, not the door, but the casualness of the forgetting, the way love once asked for everything and then pretended it never asked at all. When I tried to sleep that night, the ceiling above me felt closer than it should have been. The laundry machines groaned through the walls like restless animals, and I pressed my palm against the deed as if it could steady me. At dawn, when the house was still, I went quietly upstairs, barefoot so the boards would not betray me, and paused in front of the locked bedroom. The door was smooth, freshly painted, almost innocent in its appearance, but I knew behind it were my dresser, my linens, my books already rearranged, perhaps boxed, perhaps already claimed, and I knew, too, that the space had been erased of me in less than a day, as if I had never existed there at all. That knowledge settled in me with a weight unlike sorrow. It was clarity, unmerciful and clean, and with it came a resolve I had not tasted in years. The catalyst was not rage, not even grief. It was recognition, the sudden and irrevocable awareness that I had been written out of my own story, and that I could either accept the erasure or reach for the ink still bearing my name. It didn't fall apart in one scene worth retelling at a dinner party. It frayed along the edges in the way sweaters do when you catch them on a cabinet knob and keep moving because dinner won't cook itself. And the first threads to go were the small permissions I had mistaken for love, the little autonomies that make a person feel like a person rather than a shadow. And on the Monday after the door was claimed for the nursery, a new sheet appeared on the refrigerator beside a photo of the baby in a knit hat and a coupon for almond milk, a grid printed in neat columns titled Household Quiet Hours and Shared Spaces Expectations, my name written as Mom downstairs, to distinguish me, I suppose, from the upstairs family who did not need parenthetical placement, and the rules were delivered in the bright voice of efficiency. Please text before using the main kitchen between 6 and 9. Avoid strong smells, including onions and bleach. Do not move items on the open shelves because the AMUE system reduces morning stress. Keep the hallway clear of personal effects, and, a favorite for its prim falsehood, no laundry after 10 for everyone's sleep health. An instruction that landed in the room where my walls hummed with the drum of their late-night leggings and newborn onesies, and left me smiling into my tea at the idea of communal sacrifice. The thermostat migrated to an app on my son's phone, and I learned to put on a wool cardigan before bed, without mentioning the chill because the pediatrician says 68 is optimal for infants, and we're all making adjustments. And when I asked for the little space heater I had used for years in my ankle's winter, it was produced with the cord looped around it, and the warning pamphlet clipped on top, a gentle sermon about fire hazards in older homes, delivered as if I were a child who had been caught striking matches in a closet, and I thanked them out of habit and tucked the heater, like the old photographs, into the corner of my downstairs room where it would not offend a minimalist eye. My groceries were welcomed. Of course, anything you like, we're not dictators. But my onions were wrapped in a plastic produce bag and exiled to the garage fridge, the one that smells faintly of an old pickle jar, and my butter went into a labeled bin, Mom, beside one that read Kids' Lunches and one that read Meal Prep. The labels, a kind of cheerful zoning map that explained who belonged where without anyone having to say the ugly parts out loud. My cast iron skillet, black with years of seasoning, was thanked for its service and retired to a high cabinet after an article was produced about iron leaching and infant gut health. And in its place, a pale ceramic pan took the stove, delicate as bone china and temperamental as new money. The keys became a delicate subject, who needed which and why, and one afternoon, with the same gentle firmness used for timeouts, my daughter-in-law suggested we keep all house access on one hook by the mudroom so no one misplaces anything. And when I set my old brass key on the hook, it looked like a relic among the sleek fobs, and the key with a silicone cover in the baby's favorite color. And later that week, I discovered the back gate had a new latch to keep the dog in. A small fact that meant my route to the compost and the rosemary bush now required a text to be let out, which I did once and then not again, because I learned the rosemary could be replaced with dried flakes that offended nobody. My pills, which I have filled in a little plastic weekly box since before my husband died, became a conversation about safety and oversight. And while I have been a nurse and know the drug names like men know baseball rosters, I let my daughter-in-law line them up on the table and offer to pre-fill them on Sundays because we're a team. And I watched her neat fingers push the little doors closed like a gate in a dollhouse. And later, I took a photograph of the labels with my reading. Glasses perched at the end of my nose, not to keep score, but to remind myself that I know what keeps me alive. They asked me not to answer the door because of salespeople and neighborhood security expectations. And on the day the neighbor with the clipped hydrangeas stopped by with her lemon bars and said in that syrupy way women have when they want you to, "Confess what you are. Are you Daniel's mother or a family friend visiting from out west? We keep seeing a car we don't recognize." I smiled so widely my gums ached and said, "I am Leonore, and I am here for a time." And she made the shape of understanding with her mouth and floated away, later waving at me briskly as she wheeled her trash. Bins back up her driveway, and I understood how quickly a story reproduces itself once you feed it a seed of convenience. The house itself began to curate my absence with surprising speed. The framed photograph of my wedding, which had lived on a narrow table since we moved in, my husband in his too large suit, me with the veil my mother basted by hand, was gently placed in a shallow box labeled Family Archive after an afternoon of refreshing surfaces, and the clock with the little crack in the face that kept perfect time because it had seen worse was demoted to the downstairs room so the nursery could have something soft and round that would not snag the eye, and my books were repatriated to 3 cardboard boxes with sturdy handles, their spines bumping one another like passengers on a bus line that no longer ran to their part of town. If I came upstairs during morning flow, I felt the air tighten as if I'd entered the path of people jogging in opposite directions. My son would smile and say, "Hey, Mom," but his eyes would keep counting minutes, and my daughter-in-law would ask, "Need anything right now?" With the gentle pressure of a paramedic triaging the least urgent case on a night with too many sirens. And I learned to time my coffee for the lull when the baby slept and the house sighed. And on those blessed afternoons, I took my mug to the window above the sink and memorized the good things. The way the eucalyptus smelled when the sun warmed it, the shape the dog made when he collapsed in a patch of light, the particular click of the oven door settling shut, and I said thank you for them under my breath like a woman on a pilgrimage making mental notes of water fountains. People began to tour the house as if it were a listing, friends of friends who were curious about the layout or thinking of doing a build-out, and I kept the toilet lid closed and put a fresh towel on the rack and sat downstairs out of the way, while they admired the great bones and told my son he was lucky to have found such a place. And one evening, when a couple left through the back and the wife said, "With a little work, you could really open up that lower level for a nanny or a mother-in-law suite," I felt my lungs press higher into my chest, some old bird in me fluttering against the bars because I was right there, a living suite with hands and a heartbeat, And still I was spoken of as a square footage problem to be solved with pocket doors. They changed the Wi-Fi password to something aspirational and posted the new code on the fridge beneath a magnet shaped like an avocado. And before I could copy it from my little radio and my crossword app, it had been updated for security. And a cheerful printed card appeared on my downstairs desk that read, Guest Network. Downstairs, and I wrote it in my notebook with my mother's fountain pen like a woman recording the names of rivers she must not forget to cross. And later, when I tried to stream the old boleros that keep my husband's voice from fading at night, the signal bled in and out, and I listened to the quiet instead. Invitations began to be issued on my behalf. A tour of a very nice residence with on-site physical therapy, a luncheon at the church where so many vibrant seniors are thriving, and a brochure slid across the table with glossy photos of women my age, smiling as if someone had just told them all the husbands were down for a nap. And when I said I could not go Thursday because of my dental cleaning, my son raised his eyebrows. "You still drive there?" It's a ways and parking is tight. And I realized the car keys were the next negotiation, and I kept them that night under my pillow as if they could warm me. The baby's schedule began to colonize the day as Holy Writ, and I became a quiet monk of nap time, moving through the house with the step of a burglar. And when I dared to laugh at a photo my sister texted me, my daughter-in-law materialized as if conjured and made the shushing face, the one that says the fragile world we built will fall if you breathe wrong. And I wanted to say, loudly, that we had raised children without white noise machines, and they fell asleep on our chests to the sound of the evening news, but I did not say anything because the baby is blameless and her sleep is a sacrament I would not violate. I began to gather small proofs in the way women do whose words have been ignored too long. I photographed the deed and emailed it to myself and to a new address I invented that afternoon, a little skylight of an inbox nobody knew about. I took pictures of the pantry labels, the refrigerator rules, the calendar with my name edged in parentheses. I wrote down dates and sentences and the tone in which they were spoken, not to build a case against them so much as to build a case for myself so that when I began to doubt, as I always do, I could read the ledger and recall that I had not imagined the shrinking. When the neighbor's son backed into the mailbox one Saturday and my daughter-in-law met me at the hall with her palm up to stop my entry, "We'll handle it. Less voices will be simpler," I stood still like a deer, not out of fear, but to make a record in my bones of this precise humiliation. And then I went back to my room and folded a towel as if it were a telegram, which is to say with care and the understanding that messages go missing if you do not crease them at the right places. On my husband's birthday, I baked a small pan of cornbread in the downstairs toaster oven and ate a square slowly with butter, melting into its honeycombs. And when the smell climbed the stairs, my son called down, "Smells great," but the pediatrician says no open bakes today while her cough is lingering. And I said, of course, and opened the window and buttoned my cardigan and thought of the man who once came home smelling of motor oil and kissed my forehead in the doorway, like it was a habit that would keep us alive. There were kindnesses, too, and I am not so injured that I will erase them. My son setting my tea beside me without being asked, the dog dropping his damp toy in my lap and sighing as if I were the only person in the house who understood the particular grief of a chew toy losing its squeak, my daughter-in-law tucking a blanket around my knees one evening without looking me in the eye, and yet even their kindnesses were beveled to fit a shape I had not drawn. Kindness offered like a garnish on a plate they no longer wanted me to touch. I took them gratefully and salted them with the knowledge that even water, after enough time, will wear through stone. Each night I sat at the oak table by the back door with the good light and the linoleum that remembers feet, and I laid my day out like a rosary, bead after bead, quiet hours, labels, passwords, tours, the aversion to the words, my room. And I answered out loud the question any younger woman might ask me, is this enough to call it harm? And I said yes, because harm woven from polite thread is still a rope. And if you are looking for a trumpet or a door slammed so hard the picture frames rattle, you will be disappointed because what came instead in that gentle, relentless week was the smooth, unmistakable sensation of a line drawing itself inside me, a boundary I could feel with my tongue like the edge of a cracked tooth. And though I had not yet decided what I would do, I understood that the era of explaining my presence to people who live in my house had ended, and I put the deed back in its envelope and slid it beneath the table mat like a pressed leaf. And for the first time in a long time, I slept all the way into morning without dreaming I was knocking on a door that would not open. It is strange the way clarity arrives, not like a lightning strike that scorches the ground, but like a window shade pulled open at last. And for me, it came one quiet morning when the house was still asleep, my son and his wife upstairs with their devices glowing, the baby stirring faintly in her crib, and I sat at the oak table by the back door with my coffee and the envelope holding the deed spread out before me, my fingers smoothing the creases in the paper as though I were ironing out the years of silence I had allowed to shape me. And what I realized with a suddenness both terrifying and liberating was that I had been rehearsing vanishing for so long that they believed I no longer existed. But here was proof. My name, my signature. The inked permanence of a woman who still mattered, even if no one in this house wanted to admit it. The shift was not in them. They remained busy, preoccupied, managing their curated lives. But in me, in the slow reawakening of a truth I had tucked away, I was not a guest here. I was not a stray relative, tolerated out of obligation. I was the one whose hands had built this foundation, whose sacrifice had made their dream home possible. And I could stop waiting for them to recognize it, because recognition, I finally understood, was not theirs to give. That morning, instead of shrinking back into my laundry room corner, I put on my coat and walked outside before anyone could stop me, down the street lined with clipped hedges and driveways polished with SUVs, and I felt the air press against my face with a freshness I had not tasted in years. My knees protested, yes, but I let them ache, because moving forward on my own legs was a declaration. I walked to the library first, a squat brick building with glass doors that still smelled faintly of disinfectant from the pandemic years, and I sat at a public computer and typed in the name of the county clerk's office, my hands trembling not from ignorance but from the thrill of agency returning to me like blood to a numbed limb. The records were there, plain and unquestionable, the property title with my name, still valid, still mine. I printed the page, folded it neatly, and slid it into my purse alongside the deed itself. It felt like slipping a key into my pocket, a key they did not know I carried. I did not storm home and confront them. That is the fantasy of younger people who believe power lies only in shouting. No, my shift was quieter but more enduring. I began to plan, to build a life within and beyond these walls that did not depend on their permission. I started by reclaiming rituals. I bought a notebook with a maroon cover at the pharmacy and began writing down everything. The rules taped to the refrigerator, the careful exclusions, the conversations that tried to shrink me. Not as evidence for them, but as testimony for myself. A way to remind the woman who sometimes doubted her own memory that she was not imagining the coldness. I kept the notebook hidden beneath the mattress, each page a brick in the foundation of the self I was rebuilding. I also began to tend small gardens of autonomy. I walked every morning, sometimes just to the corner store where the clerk, a young man with acne scars and an awkward kindness, would nod at me and say, "Morning, ma'am," as if I were not invisible. I withdrew small amounts of cash from the savings account they did not know I still maintained, the one my husband and I had opened decades ago for emergencies, and each time I tucked the bills into an envelope in my dresser, I felt stronger, less cornered. I cooked for myself again. Small meals in the toaster oven, dishes that smelled like my own history. Lentil soup with cumin, cornbread baked in a tin. The scents filled the downstairs room and lingered on my clothes, a quiet rebellion against the sterile air upstairs. The true midpoint was not a single act, but a layering of many acts, each one insignificant to them, but monumental to me. I bought a secondhand coat at the thrift store, navy wool with deep pockets, and when I wore it in the evening for my walks, I felt not like a burden, but like a woman with somewhere to go. I stopped asking before touching the thermostat. Instead, I kept a small notebook of temperatures and discovered, to my own satisfaction, that the house functioned better at settings that kept me comfortable. I made a copy of my brass key at the hardware store without mentioning it to anyone, the cool metal heavy in my palm, proof that doors could still open for me. One evening, sitting at the table with my tea, I opened the deed again and laid my wedding ring beside it. The ring no longer fit. Arthritis had thickened my joints, but together, the circle of gold and the square of paper, they told me a story I had almost forgotten. I had been someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's provider, and now I was someone who could choose. That word, choose, settled into me like a stone in water, rippling out through every thought. I realized I had been waiting, endlessly waiting, for them to treat me as central, as family, as essential. But the waiting had become its own cage, and the only way out was to stop asking and start acting. The next morning, I called a lawyer, not my son's kind of lawyer, the ones who speak in careful euphemisms, but a woman in town whose office smelled of coffee and old books. I did not yet retain her. I only asked questions, but the act itself was the turning point. I told her about the deed, about the co-ownership, about the way I was being squeezed into silence. She listened, nodded, and said plainly, "You have rights." More than they want you to believe, those words, simple and unadorned, slid into me like oxygen. I walked out of her office with a card in my pocket and a new steadiness in my spine. That was the midpoint. Not confrontation, not drama, but the first true inhalation of freedom after decades of shallow breaths. From that moment on, every small step carried a different weight, not of fear, but of readiness. I was not yet at the end, but I had stopped being at the mercy of their script. I had found a new role, written in my own hand, and I was prepared to play it until the last curtain fell. Pressure does not announce itself like a storm. It returns like a tide disguised as help. And in the weeks after I began carrying the folded copy of the title in my purse, the house learned a new vocabulary of concern that pressed against me from all sides with the steady confidence of people who assume the elderly are scenery. And the first wave arrived in the form of a calendar invitation, slid across the table with a smile. "A few quick tours, Mom. Nothing binding. We just want you to see. Options." And there, in cheerful colors, were the names of 2 residences where the women in the brochures all had tidy hair and identical smiles that did not reach their eyes. I said I had already made plans for those mornings, and my daughter-in-law laughed lightly as though I had found a charming way to misunderstand the world, and my son adjusted his tone to the one he uses with accountants and waiters he hopes to impress, explaining that these weren't decisions, only explorations, that everyone was doing their best to optimize the household, a phrase that made the room tilt as if someone had quietly moved a wall. By then, the refrigerator rules had multiplied, the thermostat remained obedient to an app that warmed everyone but me, and my downstairs plate had become a permanent resident of the kitchen's least used cupboard, labeled with a strip of blue tape as if it were a science project, and yet none of that stung as much as the next thing, which wore the mask of paperwork and came after dinner on a Thursday, when the baby's cough had finally softened and the dishwasher was thrumming like a distant train. They asked if I could review a small insurance document, a phrase that would have sounded like housekeeping if not for the slight tremor in my son's hand as he slid the folder toward me. And when I opened it, the first page smiled blandly. Household. Liability update. And the second page tried to crouch behind jargon. But I have been a nurse and a wife and a mother, and I have signed forms in emergency rooms at 3 a.m. with a pen that wouldn't write. And I know the smell of a document that wants you to surrender. And there, 3 paragraphs in, was a set of words that tasted like metal. Quit claim of all present interest for purposes of refinancing and estate simplification. I did not make a speech. I took out my reading glasses and read it twice, then closed the folder, slid it back, and said with more calm than I felt that I would be happy to have my attorney review it. And the room changed temperature the way a room does when a window you hadn't seen is opened on a winter day. My daughter-in-law stiffening in her chair, my son's smile becoming careful, and then the flurry of reassurances. How this was standard, how this would streamline things, how this was simply to ensure the baby's future, as though I were a tangle in a drawer and not the drawer itself. The second wave was social, a choreography of gentle exile disguised as hospitality, and it began when a realtor appeared on a Saturday with a notebook and the kind of praise you give countertops when you don't have the heart to praise a life. Walking through the rooms while I waited downstairs and listened to her footsteps mapping the home I'd paid for, and later, when she and my son stood in the doorway of my little room pretending not to look at my bedspread, I heard the phrase, "Mother-in-law, sweet potential, if we do it right." And I thought, with the kind of patience that comes only from a long marriage and longer widowhood, that I had already been turned into potential by people who preferred neat possibilities to complicated presents. The realtor left, and the house spent the afternoon smelling faintly of her perfume, a bright synthetic thing with no memory in it. And my son made tea and told me not to worry about anything, that nothing was happening yet, that this was simply information gathering, and in that yet I heard a clock start. The third wave carried official seal and badge, a welfare check born from an anonymous call I could have written myself if I had been cruel. And on a gray morning, 2 polite officers knocked and asked if I was safe, if I was being cared for, if I had access to my medications and my funds, and the ache of it was not their presence, but the performance that followed. My daughter-in-law appearing with a tray of muffins, my son answering the questions with the serene competence of a man who has never watched a door shut on him from the wrong side, and me standing between them and the officers like a woman in the wrong photograph, saying, yes, I am safe, and yes, I can leave the house, and yes, I can reach the bank. And here, if you'd like, is the deed. With my name and the card of my attorney, both offered with a hand that did not shake. The younger officer's eyes softened in a way I recognized from years of tending the frightened, and when they left, promising nothing and guaranteeing less, my son said he had no idea who would have called, that people make mischief, that one cannot be too careful, and I said, because I have learned to lay bricks with words, that one also cannot be too transparent, and that going forward all conversations about property or care would include counsel. And in the quiet that followed, I felt the house adjust itself around me, finding that I did not bend as easily as before. The fourth wave was subtler and would have gone unnoticed if I had not been awake to small shifts. My mail began to arrive opened, not maliciously, my son said, simply by accident because the envelopes looked like his. The bank called to confirm a request to add a contact to my account that I had not made, and the pharmacy left a message about consolidating prescriptions in a family plan to ease logistics. a plan with my daughter-in-law's name on the contact line, and in each of these, I heard the future knocking softly, a house next month in which my name would be a shadow because paper had made it so. I did not accuse. I walked to the bank with my maroon notebook and added a password no one could guess because it was my mother's middle name, spoken in the accent only the dead remember. And I placed a small note with the teller stating that no, changes could be made without me in person. And then I walked to the attorney's office and said that I would like letters drafted, clear and unambiguous, outlining my ownership, my capacity, and my refusal to convey any interest now or later. And as we spoke, I felt again the delicious steadiness of oxygen in a lung that had forgotten how to expand. The fifth wave was personal and almost broke me, not because it was cruel, but because it was kind in the wrong way, and it arrived on a night when the baby's fever spiked, and my daughter-in-law, pale with fear and exhaustion, pressed the monitor into my hand and said she needed to shower and cry and not be anyone's mother for 20 minutes. And I took the warm weight of that responsibility and sat by the crib, singing the old lullaby my husband had sung off-key. And when the fever broke, I could have forgiven everyone anything. That is how disorienting relief is. And in the morning, when my son placed his hand over mine at the table and said that he knew I loved them, and that the best way to show that love would be to sign the papers so they could refinance and give the baby a bedroom with better light, I almost believed him, because love makes you stupid and service makes you obedient. But then I looked at our hands and saw my mother's knuckles in mine and my father's scar across the left one where I cut it on the can in 1962, and I remembered who paid for light in this house, and the fog lifted. I told him I would not sign. I told him I had not vanished. I told him my name, the whole of it, as if he were a stranger at a window asking who lived here. That refusal was a match to a slow fuse. The next days were a study in pressure, a family meeting called on a Sunday afternoon with a charcuterie board, and the rhetoric of balance. My daughter-in-law speaking of fairness and the need to think long-term, my son invoking taxes and liability, and me countering each point with the professional calm of a woman who has held dying hands and not flinched, explaining that long-term thinking had already been done when I signed the down payment, that fairness would look like. Acknowledgement, not erasure, that liability in this house came from the habit of pretending I was not here. They did not shout. They did not insult. They simply withdrew warmth like a landlord cutting heat in March, and the chill of their distance reminded me how dangerous polite estrangement can be for women like me who were raised to make peace even with the knife still in us. The past returned then in the way memory does when the present rhymes with it. My sister and I in my mother's kitchen, the day we moved her to the back bedroom because it's nearer the bathroom, my mother's face composed and gracious as she thanked us for thinking of her comfort, and the way she cried into her pillow that night because she could hear the party in the front room and did not want to be the kind of mother who spoke of loneliness. I carried that memory to the lawyer and laid it on the desk between us like an heirloom I was determined not to pass on, and we made a plan in the kind of sentences that do not require apology. Notice of co-ownership taped to the inside of the front door. Request for all contractors, appraisers, or agents to confirm appointments through my counsel. Letter to the mortgage servicer outlining my refusal to encumber the property without my written consent, and a quiet appointment with a notary to document my capacity for the days when someone might decide that my insistence was a symptom, not a boundary. The house did not like this new arrangement, and it sulked in small ways. My place at the table was moved a chair down to make room for the baby's high chair. The guest Wi-Fi code changed again with a note that said, "Text us if you need it, my Cast iron pan disappeared until I asked for it 3 times, and even the dog hesitated at my doorway as if he had been reprimanded for loving me too openly. And yet, when the notary came and we signed the papers in the patch of sun by the back door, I felt something inside me settle that had been rattling for months. Then came the rehearsal for war. My son scheduled a meeting to clear the air and arrived with a man he called a financial advisor who asked me questions in a voice like warm syrup about my goals, my energy, my desire to ease burden on the next generation. And when I said my goal was to be left intact in my own home, and my energy was for living, not for facilitating a transfer of assets to people who could not say the word mother out loud in public, the advisor made the face of someone, disappointed by numbers, and my son squeezed his water glass until I thought it might crack, and the man recommended, with the confidence of a person who has never had to choose between gas and groceries, that we consider a revocable trust with them, as trustees, purely administrative, and I laughed, not loudly, but in that way you do when someone tells you a joke that reveals more about them than they intend. And I said I would consider it after hell froze, and my husband returned with a bouquet, and then I stood up, thanked him for his time, and asked him to leave. The final push of that month was practical and almost beautiful in its cruelty. An email chain accidentally forwarded to me in which a stager was asked about furniture placement after we get the title cleaned, the phrase cleaned doing the work of 1,000 sermons scrubbing me out like a stain. Then a whispered conversation on the patio caught by the breeze in which my daughter-in-law said she did not want my shadow in every room, and my son said that everyone would understand once the paperwork was done, and I sat at the oak table, folded the email into my notebook, and circled the word cleaned 3 times, because sometimes the humiliation is so plain that the only thing left to do is underline it. That night I dreamed of keys, hundreds of them, jangling, none of them fitting any door I tried, and when I woke I walked barefoot upstairs and stood before the nursery, the room that had been mine, and I laid my palm against the smooth paint and said aloud, softly, that I would not be made into a ghost. If you want the moment that tested me most, it was not the papers or the officials or the staged kindness. It was a Tuesday morning when my son, perhaps believing he was making a compassionate compromise, suggested that I keep the downstairs space, as long as I liked, in exchange for signing away my interest in the upper floors, a kind of internal exile written in legal ink, and the neatness of his proposal almost undid me because it spoke so precisely to the way my generation of women have been invited to disappear, graciously, with gratitude and a scented candle. I said no, not because I am stubborn, though I am, but because I have learned in the long school of my life that the smallest concession, once enshrined in paper, becomes the map others use to find their way to your erasure, and I will not draw that map for them. So the pressure rose, and I did not bow. And it is astonishing how much of a life can be measured by such small engineering. The angle of a chair, the angle of a signature, the angle of a spine against the weight of a family's preference. And in the middle of it all, the baby learned to sit, then to clap, and every time she clapped her hands together with that delighted shock, I remembered that we are not born to be quieted. We are taught it, and we can unlearn it, even at 78. Even in a house where the doors close gently and the rules are written in friendly fonts. I began to sleep with my shoes by the bed the way I did in nursing school, not out of fear, but out of readiness, and I kept the deed beneath the table mat and the lawyer's number on a card inside the little dish where I once kept hairpins. And when the mail came, I met it at the door like a woman greeting a ship she has been owed for years. The second escalation did what it needed to do. It burned the last fog from my mind and left me with a clean horizon and a timetable I did not share with anyone. And if they mistook my quiet for surrender, that is their error to nurse, not mine. I was not preparing to leave. I was preparing to act, and the difference between those two kinds of preparation is the difference between being carried and choosing your own steps. And when you have been stepped over long enough, there comes a day when you lift your foot and place it down where it will not be moved again. The final act was quieter than anyone would imagine. Not fireworks, not raised voices, not even a slammed door, but the kind of irrevocable gesture that redraws the map of your life in ink. And for me, it happened one gray morning when I woke before the house and, dressed in my navy coat with the deep pockets, slid the envelope with the deed inside and walked down the street to the lawyer's office where the air smelled of coffee and fresh paper. And I signed the letters that made my refusal official, not just words whispered in kitchens or murmured over coffee, but stamped, notarized, binding letters that declared in black and white that I was of sound mind, that I would not sign away my share, that no one could sell, refinance, or erase me without my hand on the page. And as the notary pushed the document toward me and the pen hovered above the line, I felt my wrist steady in a way it had not in years, as if every humiliation, every quiet dismissal had been training for this moment of perfect clarity. I signed full name, each letter sharp and deliberate, and when I handed it back, the lawyer smiled not with triumph, but with recognition, as if to say, "You remembered yourself at last." I walked home slowly, not because my knees ached, but because I wanted the rhythm of each step to settle the new truth into my bones. I had done something that could not be undone. The house stood there with its polished lawn and its curated emptiness, but I carried the power now, folded in my pocket, no longer abstract but actual. When I opened the door, my son was at the counter with his phone, my daughter-in-law arranging fruit into symmetrical rows, and they looked up, smiling politely, as if we were still playing the same game. I set my coat over the chair, laid the envelope on the table, and said in a voice so calm it startled even me, "You should know I've secured my rights. Nothing in this house moves without me now." Silence fell, a silence thick enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator. My son's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and then he said, "Mom, you didn't have to," but the words were limp, unconvincing. My daughter-in-law set down a slice of melon with unnecessary care and said, "We were only trying to make things easier." And I looked at her with the kind of patience born of decades of half-truths and said, "Easier for whom?" She did not answer. I did not shout. I did not accuse. I simply opened the envelope, pulled out the notarized letter, and placed it flat on the counter. "This is final," I said. "No more conversations about selling. No more tours for strangers. No more papers slid across the table with polite explanations. It ends here." My son's face reddened, not with anger, but with the sudden recognition that his story of control had been rewritten without him. He reached for the paper, then withdrew his hand as though it burned. For a long moment we stood there, the three of us, and I realized that the power of a climax is not volume, but permanence. They knew now. The game was over. That night, I reclaimed my room, not the guest space downstairs by the laundry, but my old bedroom, the one they had taken for themselves with their soft furnishings and their talk of nursery light. I opened the door without knocking, stepped inside, and began to move my things back, box by box, frame by frame, each object a declaration. My books returned to the shelves, my photographs to the dresser, my quilts folded at the foot of the bed. They watched, silent, my son at the threshold, my daughter-in-law with her arms crossed, but neither spoke, because the deed had already spoken for me. When I laid my wedding picture on the nightstand and smoothed the bedspread with my hands, I felt a stillness descend, not relief, not joy, but something firmer, sovereignty. The confrontation they expected never came. No shouting match, no accusations. Instead, the house itself changed hands in spirit. The thermostat clicked warmer because I turned it myself. The dog curled at my feet as though he had been waiting for me to return to my rightful place. Even the silence seemed to shift, less suffocating, more mine. And when neighbors came by that weekend with bottles of wine and polite questions, I did not hide. I answered the door myself, smiled, and when one woman asked, "And you are?" I said, "I am Martha, the owner of this home," and watched the surprise flicker across her face before she rearranged it into hospitality. The words were not dramatic, but they landed with the weight of a stone dropped in water. Undeniable, impossible to take back. In the days that followed, the air between us grew brittle. My son avoided long conversations. My daughter-in-law retreated into busy schedules, but neither of them attempted another paper, another trick, another performance of concern. They knew the ground had shifted, that the authority they thought was theirs had been reclaimed in a single signature, and I moved through the house not like a ghost or a guest, but like a woman who remembered her own name. The climax was not a scream. It was a pen on paper, a door reopened, a photograph restored to its rightful place. And from that moment forward, I was no longer waiting to be erased. I had written myself back into the story, and the ink was dry. Peace did not arrive with applause. It came like a good dusk, slow along the baseboards, the house learning the new shape of my breath as I moved through it without asking permission. And in those first weeks after the paper was stamped and the door to my old room stood open again, I let myself practice an ordinary that had nothing to prove, hanging my curtains back up even though the fabric had faded along the hem, placing my books in the order that made sense to my hands rather than to any guest's eye, putting the clock with the hairline crack back on the dresser because it kept time honestly, and I discovered that rooms forgive you quickly when you return to them with your full name. My son tried for days to resume the rhythm that worked for him, filling the space with errands and messages, the bright noise of a busy life, but the house had changed key, and even he could hear it. And one afternoon he came to the threshold of my room with his mouth set in that way he has when he is trying to be decent and not quite making it, and he said they were thinking of renting a place nearer his office, that it would simplify the commute and the schedule, and 100 other small logistics he listed like beads. And I nodded without rescuing him and said, I wish them good mornings and easy nights, and when he reached for something kinder, I didn't give him my softness to take away with the boxes. There is, I learned, a tenderness that belongs to you completely, and you can keep it without becoming hard. When they left, it was not a scene from a play, no suitcases hurled, no speeches, just the work of a Saturday, lists on a phone, tape on cardboard, the baby's socks tucked into a zippered pouch, and I put a loaf of bread into the oven because leaving makes people hungry even when they don't know where their hunger lives. At the end, my daughter-in-law stood by the door with the baby on her hip and met my eyes for the first time in months without arranging her face, and she said quietly that she had not understood what a deed meant until it was too late, that she had wanted a house that looked like a life without letting anyone's true life live in it. And I told her without malice that paper only reads what we write on it, that we had written something new, and I touched the baby's cheek with 2 fingers, a blessing small enough to pass unnoticed, and watched them go. I did not feel triumphant, only calibrated, as if a level set on a long shelf had finally stopped wobbling. After they were gone, I let silence do the kind thing and reveal what it was hiding, not emptiness, but room. I carried the laundry basket upstairs because the steps belonged to me again. I opened the windows on a day the weather thought it could get. Away with being gloomy and made it admit light. I went to the garden and cut the rosemary back hard and planted 3 stubborn marigolds that will insist on blooming even when no one compliments them. And at the hardware store, I had 2 extra keys, made. One to hang on a ribbon behind the pantry door, and one for the dish of small mercies I keep by the sink. Not because I fear being locked out anymore, but because the weight of a key in a woman's palm is a sentence the world remembers how to hear. The dog, who had practiced uncertainty for so long, decided on his own that he was mine, and the neighbor with the hydrangeas began to wave like a person who understands the difference between curiosity and surveillance, and the thermostat, freed from its scolding numbers, learned how to be kind to an old body at dawn. For a time, I cooked for one and set the table for 2, the missing chair a reminder that love can remain when access ends. And on Thursdays, I brought a plate of lemon bars to the community center and sat with 3 women whose names I got wrong twice before remembering. Women who had their own quiet archives of being put away for convenience, and we laughed into our cups about nothing and everything until the room warmed. On a Sunday, I took the thick envelope from the drawer and walked to the copy shop where the clerk called me ma'am without pity, and we made 3 clean copies of the deed and the letters and sealed them in new sleeves. This, too, is a kind of prayer. I called my lawyer only once more to tell her the house was peaceful and that I wanted to add a simple note to my file. No decisions made in fear, no signatures under pressure, hospitality. Yes, but never again at the price of visibility. And she said that line should be taught in school. Weeks turned to a season, and the hallways accepted the sound of my shoes as the default. And I found that I liked my own company more than I had expected. I still had mornings when I set out 2 cups by accident, and nights when the bed felt wider than necessary. But solitude, when it is chosen, is a field and not a pit, and I walked it like a woman willing to learn new paths. One afternoon, the man, who calls me simply Grandma, sent a photograph of a bookshelf he'd built with his own hands in a small apartment, several zip codes away. The shelves not quite level, the books leaned together like cousins, and beneath the photo he wrote, "It feels like home because I made it." And I sat at the oak table and cried the kind of tears that wash dust instead of breaking anything. And I wrote back, "Yes, that's what it is." And I put my pen down on a page where I had already written my grocery list and the date of the next doctor's appointment, and the ordinariness of that page made me feel brave. I have not grown younger in this story. The stairs still have opinions, and the winter will take more layers than it used to. But I have grown proportion to my life, and that is a luxury most women are told is too expensive. And if I have anything to say to the one reading this who is standing on the wrong side of a freshly painted door, while someone you love calls your erasure practical, it is this: keep a clean copy of whatever bears your name. Keep a key that answers only to your hand. Keep a record of the day you decided your voice is not a favor to anyone. And when you are ready, not a minute sooner, pick up one small thing that is yours and put it where it belongs. Because the world changes every time a woman moves one object back into her own orbit without apology. Start with a photograph or a pen or the thermostat. Start with a sentence you speak out loud in a room that thought you had forgotten your language. Start by opening a window, and if anyone asks you to be reasonable, ask them kindly to define the word. And when they cannot, pour yourself tea and sit in the chair that fits your back. In the evenings now, I like to walk the length of the hallway and back and touch the door frames with my fingertips, the way a lighthouse keeper checks the glass, a habit that would look eccentric from the street but makes perfect sense to the person who once lived as a roomer in her own home. I sleep with the window cracked and a small fan that sounds like steady rain, even in clear weather. And in the morning, the light does not ask for permission to enter. It simply comes. And so do I. And that is what passes for a happy ending at my age. Nothing cinematic, everything exact, the slow and daily choosing of a self that refuses to be boxed and labeled and stacked in a garage for later. If I ever leave this house, it will be because I choose a smaller kitchen and a larger sky, and I will leave the key on the hook by the pantry for the next woman who needs a room that remembers how to say her name. And on the inside of the front door, I will tape a note the size of a grocery receipt that reads in letters big enough for poor eyes and good minds, "No one gets to clean you out of your own life. You get to live here, fully, until you decide otherwise. And then you get to leave with your head up and your pockets heavy with proof